and welcome to variation 25. This variation is about down bow ricochet. Ricochet, besides being an impressive bowing, is also a bowing which will help your bow technique a lot. The reason for this is that ricochet is a passive bowing, which means we're working with the energy of the bouncing bow more than with the bow itself. And because of that, we learn how the bow works, we get a good feeling for the bow, and our bow technique improves in general. I remember that was the case with myself when I first started working at Ricochet and really learning it. All of my bow technique seemed to improve, and I noticed the same thing with my pupils. So this is Ricochet, and think about it in a way a little bit like a basketball player plays with the energy of the bouncing ball. We need to get a feel for that with the bow. So to get a feel for it, start off just by letting the bow bounce. Just throw it on the string. That's the easiest bowing in the world. Literally everybody can do that. You just drop the bow on the string. As you notice, it will bounce. So do that a few times, just to get a feeling for it. You will notice if you press the stick down a little bit after you've dropped it, it will bounce faster. If you don't, it'll bounce slower. So play around with that a little bit. Let it bounce slowly and let it bounce faster. All you're doing is pressing the stick down a little bit. If you press it down too much, you'll stop it. So there already you are getting a feeling for how much weight you can add to the bow stick. So practice that a bit, and when you feel familiar with it, practice it on all strings, with open strings and also with stopped notes, so that you really get a feeling for this bouncing bow. The next step that you do when you feel comfortable with that is that you catch it by changing direction. Basically, you let the bow bounce, and then by changing the direction, you're basically catching it. You're stopping the ricochet and also stopping the bouncing. So just do that. It doesn't matter when you do it, just get a feel for changing the direction and catching the ricochet that way. When you feel familiar with that, the next step will be to catch it after a specific amount of bounces. So catch it after it bounced 4 times. A little bit helpful will be not to actually count up to 4, because you usually can't count that fast, but to listen to what it sounds like if you catch it after the 4th note. The next step will be to catch it after 3. And the next step will be to catch it after 2. That's what you need for this variation. Practice that also on all strings and with open strings and with stopped notes. Now the next step will be a bit closer to actually preparing what you need for the variation. You also drop the bow, catch it after it bounced twice, and do 2 up bows. That will be like this. Do that on stopped notes as well. Stay about in the middle at first, so that you don't travel too far in one direction, and just get used to that. The next step will be to add a long note. And travel to the frog before the long note. Practice that until you're familiar with it, because you'll be glad if you practice that on something easy like one note before you actually do it in the variation. Now, when you start practicing this variation, the first thing you need to take care of is the left hand. The reason for this is that ricochet, being a passive bowing, requires the left hand to follow the bow, because the bow bounces. You're not controlling the bounces. you can direct them to a certain extent, but the bow bounces on its own, and it's not going to wait with its bounces for your left hand fingers to be in place. The left hand has to follow the bow. There's no other way to do it. So whenever you have ricochet to do, the left hand has to be even more secure than it normally needs to be. So in this case, the key is F minor, which is also not the most comfortable key on the violin. Spend plenty of care and time to organize the left hand and to secure the left hand, because you won't be able to deal with it once you start doing ricochet. So first of all, don't worry about the bow at all. Just sort out the intonation and what you're supposed to do with the left hand. So do it with the bow on the string. Doesn't matter how much bow you use. Make sure the fourth is in tune. Make sure the fifth is in tune. And as from bar 9, make sure you secure the octaves. Practice them as octaves so that your hand remembers the hand position of an octave. And so on. So that'll be the first thing you need to do, and trust me, it's not easy. The next thing you do is that you adjust your bowing so that you are still playing on the string and slowly and still concentrating on the left hand, but your bow division is now what you need for the variation. It's like one step in between. So you start in the middle and stay in the middle. Remember to go down to the frog before you do the fifth. That doesn't sound very impressive, and it might not be all that inspiring, but it's certainly very, very useful if you can do that, and you can do that securely before you start dealing with the ricochet bowing as well. When you start adding the ricochet, it's a good idea not to expect yourself to play it through right away, because as soon as you do ricochet, the bow decides which speed you do it. You cannot really do it slowly anymore. So one way of doing it is to go bar by bar. I will go into how one practices ricochet slowly at the end of this video when I give you a couple of practicing tips for ricochet in general. But I'll work through how you can practice this variation first. So just start with the very beginning, the 2 ricochet down bows and 2 up bows. Just practice that. Then add the rest of the bar. And do that a few times. Remember, bow division in this part of the variation, you're supposed to stay in the middle. You're not supposed to travel. Practice that until you feel comfortable with it, and then do the next one. Until you feel happy with that, and then add the rest of that bar. And then you do the next one. And then the next one. And now remember, for that, you're supposed to travel to the frog. Practice that until you feel comfortable and work your way through the variation that way. Remember, as from bar 9, the bow division requires you to travel to the frog every time. So bear in mind the bow division in this variation. Sometimes you're supposed to stay in the middle and sometimes you're supposed to travel to the frog. Now, because Ricochet is a passive bowing and the bow bounces on its own and you can only control the speed of how fast it bounces to a very, very small extent, actually it's not possible to practice Ricochet slowly, but there's a way around it. What you can do is you can exaggerate what the bow is doing. Technically that's no longer Ricochet because it's no longer passive, but it's certainly an excellent help for Ricochet to actually be able to practice it slowly. It also helps synchronizing left and right hand. That would be like this. To be completely exact, what you're doing is you're dropping the bow just once. So maybe one could classify it as Ricochet, but that requires an active movement for each note, which would actually speak for it not being Ricochet. Whatever it is and whatever its name is, I found it very, very helpful. So what you do is you exaggerate what the bow is doing, also exaggerate how high you lift it, so that you have a chance of synchronizing left and right hand. I'll show you again briefly. With the up bows, what you're doing is you're staying in one place, you're doing a circular motion, similar to what I explained in variation 15, and that's also basically an exaggeration of what you need to do later. So that is something which I found very, very helpful, and something which I do with every Ricochet that I need to do. I do it in an exaggerated, slow practice. Another thing which you should know is the tilting of the bow. You can tilt it towards the fingerboard and you can tilt it towards the bridge. I'll show you. That's towards the fingerboard and that's towards the bridge. And that will have an influence on the bouncing of the bow. If you tilt it towards the fingerboard, it will bounce less and it will be a more soft sound. And if you tilt it towards the bridge, it will bounce more and it will be a stronger sound. So tilt it towards the fingerboard and tilt it towards the bridge is like this. I just showed you both extremes. You will have to play around with both extremes and find what you actually want. If you want it to be more of a stronger sound, make sure you play with nearly all the hairs or all the hairs. If you want it to be less harsh, then tilt the bow slightly towards the fingerboard. The reason this makes a difference is when you tilt the bow towards the fingerboard, you are playing with less hair and therefore there is less tension on the string and in the bow, and therefore the bow bounces less. So that's one thing you can play around with to get the actual Ricochet sound that you would like. Another thing which I noticed in this variation, it's helpful to jump comparatively high. Usually I would recommend not jumping higher than you need to, because the higher you jump, the less control you have over the whole thing. But in this variation, it seemed to actually give me more control to jump higher. So that would be more like this. So I'm jumping quite high. There again, if you're not satisfied with your Ricochet or you want to improve it or play around with it more, then experiment with how far you let the bow actually leave the string, how far away from the string the bow hairs should actually go. One more thing I'd like to mention, I mentioned it in the beginning already, is that you can play around with the speed of ricochet by adding pressure to the stick of the bow. So if you're not happy with the speed of it, if your ricochet is too slow, for example, and you just have, and you want to get that up to speed, what you do is you add a little bit of pressure to the stick of the bow for the down bow ricochet. And even more pressure. So if you press down the stick a little bit when you're bouncing, you will speed up the ricochet. Same, obviously, the reverse. If you don't and you take weight away, which means that your hand will be leaning towards the fourth finger, then your ricochet will be slower. So that's one more thing which might be helpful. I hope you enjoyed this. Ricochet, I personally find Ricochet a lot of fun. I enjoy it a lot, and I hope you enjoy it too. Next variation, variation 26, we're going to deal with up bow Ricochet. So hope to see you there. Bye.